Well, very good. Thank you all. I think we're going to be we're going to be joined by a number of other people. However, I'd like to get into the content since we only have 90 minutes. So I hope everyone can see what's on my screen. We have some slides we'd like to work from today. And so can I get at least one yes? Can people see this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Great. Here we go. Well, so Tim and Mark are supposed to be doing this. It looks like it's going to be mostly Tim. And see, where did it? Hello. There we go. So what we would like to present is a. Oh, wait a minute. Just a second. A little bit of a technology issue here. Where'd it go? Well, there it is. And I want to make sure that this doesn't get away from me. Okay. So here we go. We'll see. We have a model. The Global Facilitators Serving Communities has a model that really helps facilitators understand their personal behavior, their job description, and their network of colleagues in disaster situations. And we're all about trying to help build resilient communities using facilitation practices and principles. So we want to do, we've done some introductions. We'll talk a little bit more, at least about who Mark and I are, talk a little bit about GFSC and its process and this crisis change choice model. And then we'd like to spend a good part of the time together with questions and discussion, including your own experiences and insights about facilitating in disaster situations, because there are a number of approaches out there. And we believe that these are complementary. We don't believe these are in competition, at least many of them. So here we go. Please interrupt with a chat or with your with a verbal question if you'd like to. Otherwise, please put your microphone on mute, just in case there's any background noise or echo. Just a couple of words about who Mark and I are. Mark runs a consulting company out of Shenzhen, does a lot of work with providing facilitation services and strategic planning with the private sector in China. I'm an individual consultant, planner, and facilitator working here in the state of New Mexico in the United States. I worked a long time with the Institute of Cultural Affairs and learned a lot of my facilitation techniques with the ICA in Southeast Asia and the States. And I work with a whole bunch of different groups in both the public and private sector. We can talk more about that later, but let's get into this. GFSC, what is GFSC? Global Facilitators Serving Communities. We're a nonprofit organization, and while we're registered in the US, it's a group of volunteers, many of whom have their own facilitation practice or work within companies or agencies as facilitators. But we really believe that people in communities are capable of self-determination, and that we think facilitation is an underused and effective catalyst to help build and, as it says here, maintain resilient and self-reliant communities. What GFSC does is provide, as we say, mentoring methods and materials to assist communities. And this final, I'd like to focus on the bullet at the bottom. We don't focus on emergency relief. There are many groups who do very heroic and effective work small nonprofits up to the UN about providing emergency relief to people experiencing disasters. However, let me pose the question this way. What happens when all those folks go home? Or another way of saying it is, what happens 6 months to a year to 2 years later as people may have started to rebuild the physical community that they live in, but have they attended to the social networks, the social bonds, the things that actually identify in many cases what a community is for people, a lot of the invisible networking. So we really want to focus on how do we rebuild the social net that a community really is. There are a couple of examples. We can talk about these in more detail if you're interested, but over the last 20, 30, almost 30 years now, in a number of places, really following earthquakes or floods, that type of natural disaster. We're getting a little bit of echo. If you could put your mic on mute, I really appreciate it. Thank you. And we also provide workshops. This crisis change choice model can be offered in a workshop from 1 to 3 days, and we can talk about that as we go forward. The process of, we're really talking about psychosocial reconstruction. This is the formal term that we're working within. And the model is part of a whole process. Crisis change model is part of a whole process where what we're trying to do is help people learn how to learn and how to remember and integrate the reactions they've had to crisis, and to figure out what could be both effective and ineffective, both behaviors and strategies to responding to crisis. And this is very important for, especially in my experience, professional facilitators, to adapt and understand what's effective in terms of leadership style. Many of us, I will say us, who work in the private or public sectors as professional facilitators find that what we think is effective there may not be effective in terms of style and practice and tone when we get to working with communities that experience a traumatic event. So we'll talk about that in a minute. We also, part of this whole process is a greater awareness of how to care for oneself, and then also how to help the local community plan, how to cascade what they've learned with this model to other people. Here we go. Once again, excuse me for interrupting myself, but we've got some background noise. So let me appeal to everyone to please put their microphone on mute. Is everyone else hearing this? There we go. Thank you so much. So the crisis change choice model, we talk about things in 3 major pieces, if you will. Each one of these areas needs to be attended to in this model. So let's take them in turn. So the first thing is the idea of when we're talking about crisis is being used as a term in a number of situations. You could have a marriage crisis, which could be really critical. You could have an organizational crisis. We're talking about historical or natural disasters as our primary way of looking at things as crisis. It's what is an event that alters your entire universe, and from which and after which everything has changed. Now, this can be what the examples I offered before can fit that definition. We're talking about in a community context primarily. So we'd like to actually offer as a takeaway from this webinar, an exercise that we use in many of our workshops. And what we do is ask people in groups of 2 or 3 to actually share your experience to identify an event, a real traumatic event or a crisis in your life, and then to try to describe your world 2 minutes before the event, and then 2 minutes after the event, or the news of it, because it may have happened down the street or in the next neighborhood. And really go into detail. What were you doing? What did you see, hear, taste, smell? And share those, and then reflect in the small group, and then you could also reflect in a large group. And this needs to be done, I think this can be done with groups that have really had experienced a crisis, as well as in our workshops. In the workshop, what it does is help people have a firsthand understanding of what we're talking about as we then explore the model. If you're working in a real community that's experienced a crisis, sometimes this particular type of exercise can take a half a day or a day, but handled sensitively, it can really help people begin the healing process. And it's, for facilitators, you may understand how this could work. Let me ask Mark or Lenny or BJ if you'd like to say anything about this.
One thing I'd like to say is that this process allows you to just touch what had happened, and so they're not going. You know, it's not having people explore the whole experience, but just that minute before, the minute after, when they realized that they were actually in a disaster. And I had the chance of doing this in the Philippines after one of the hurricanes, and we had a group, and each person just talked about that minute before and minute afterwards. It was very, very powerful, but just gave them a short little way to touch and explore their feeling, and also see, you know, other people's experience. One of our colleagues who joined us said, I was curious about how you could do this with a group. Well, that's part of what it can be a useful dynamic in this, is that, you know, they get a chance to talk about their own experience, but they also have a chance to hear about others' experience. So that helps them sort of start integrating what's been going on.
And even having a sense of empathy right from the beginning, so they feel like they're not alone, but they're also beginning to, right from the beginning, recall the sense of community and social bonds that I mentioned earlier. Yep. Okay. Continue. And then we have a reflection. What was it like before? What was it like after? So first thing is the idea of a definition of crisis, as we've just talked about, and maybe the ability to talk about it. The second part of the model is the acknowledgement that change has really happened. And sorry, I'm playing with my slideshow, excuse me, and the timing. There are two things that really matter in this model. The idea that there are 4 dimensions of denial, that a change has happened, and the idea that the initial reactions happen in all aspects of our being. So I'm sorry about the timing here. I didn't realize I had it on. So the first thing is that we've heard about, this is really a response to grief. And if a crisis has happened and the change is happening to people, we tend to deny it. But what we want to pose is the idea that we not only say, well, nah, it really didn't happen. Or, nah, it couldn't. I don't know. I don't really believe it. Deny the existence, but we also tend to deny the significance. Well, it really doesn't. Yeah, it happened, but it's not that big a deal. We also tend to deny the options available to us. Yeah, it happened. I don't know what I can do. And we tend to deny the network of resources that may be available around us. Well, there's things I could do, but I'm alone. I have nobody that I can turn to or help that could help me. And the other thing is the idea that it happens in all aspects of our being, that there are physical changes. People eat more or less, they sleep more or less, there's psychological reactions. They tend to believe either something has happened or hasn't happened. They cling to people or they avoid people. There are social reactions, and there are even spiritual reactions. Either go to church more, or they tend to deny that that any supernatural or God is helping us. Our point with the GFSC perspective is that all of these things are natural, normal, and many times necessary. To say that another way, a little more seriously, grief is not pathological. And our experience is that many times you see people who are quote unquote normal, and they're doing things that are atypical or quote unquote abnormal. And we will immediately say they need to see a counselor, or you need to get a Prozac or some kind of medical reaction. And we think that it's very important to emphasize that when you see people responding to grief, even in a resilient way, they may be behaving in atypical, quote unquote, manner. But this is not abnormal. This is normal, natural, normal, and many times necessary. I realize I sound quite strident, but one of the things that we think is really important to underline is this idea of this being natural, normal, and necessary. Again, Mark or Lenny or BJ, anything you'd like to add to this?
This is Lenny. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So what I've noticed in going through this and facilitating this kind of an experience is that it is so powerful for people who are hearing this for the first time and are in the room together and actually go through the exercise that you and Mark just talked about. Many people immediately understand the possibilities of being able and the need to reconstruct and to support that social and psychological network after the physical physical reconstruction has begun. And I feel that this is a real piece of the discovery of the thinking that has to go on in order for people to begin to see that everybody else is going through what I'm going through, and we need to work together to create a sense of resiliency among us so we can move forward.
Thank you. Okay. Unless BJ, you have something, I'm going to keep going because we may have lots of discussion at the end. So
keep going.
okay, the third point of our of the model is that something happened. It happened. It really happened, and we tend to deny it, and it really affects us. And we get to a point where we do make choices. It's not just that we now have a choice. We begin to make choices. We begin to respond to what has happened to us externally, crisis, and internally in terms of the change. And so there are, for the facilitator, there are ways for the person or community experiencing the crisis, there are ways of responding effectively and ineffectively, and it correspondingly, for the facilitator, there are ways of responding effectively and ineffectively. So let's explore that a little bit. We think there's real opportunity to move toward resilience and self-reliance. There's also real danger in moving to unintended consequences and having many people in the community experience what we call a secondary crisis where professional help is really needed. We are not discounting the importance of professional help when I say that the response to grief is natural, normal, and sometimes necessary. We just think that initially it isn't always necessary to think of it in medical terms. So this is a layered model. The first layer is that of understanding some stages of grief. The first one is that of survival. And this is a lot where emergency aid organizations really tend to work most effectively in. Literally, physical needs, attending to physical needs. Tending then to more immediate social needs. The idea of feeling safe is really important. Once that has been handled, we can talk about how people can begin to think about their needs themselves. And then the fourth stage we'd like to identify is that of working as a community or really transcending one's own personal needs exclusively. And there are coping strategies to work in each of these stages. So, and we have some jargony titles for these things. So when we talk about ineffective strategies that correspond to each one of these stages, we use these terms: avoid, abdicate, automate, alienate. So avoid is when you're in a survival stage, a lot of times you run away. When you're in a security stage, you tend to deny responsibility or abdicate responsibility. These are in an ineffective strategy. At the autonomy level, you tend to get stuck. And at the community level, you tend to push people away and alienate yourself. Effective coping strategies where you take opportunity at the security stage, at the survival stage, if you accommodate, that is just sort of accept help. Assimilate is you begin to integrate. This is where storytelling begins to be really helpful and goes through the other three. Activate is where you begin to think about possibility for yourself, and associate is where you begin to think about how we can work together to rebuild. So we try to have these correspond to each of the stages, but the squiggly lines are intended to imply that things don't happen in a neat patterns. Things go back and forth and up and down. And so these little categories have a lot of fuzzy boundaries around them. The other thing that you'll see that's introduced here, we haven't completed the model quite yet, but at the bottom, you see references to typical behaviors and leadership style. So what you will notice that typically people at a survival stage of recovery are in a reactive mode. At the security stage, they will be receptive to suggestions. Typical behaviors that may be associated with the autonomy stage is that of being proactive and interactive at the community building stage. So we find that an effective leadership style for facilitators also changes from stage to stage, from something much more directive to something more consulting. So what I mean by what I'd like to say in my own experience is, so professionally, I work with people and I'm usually at a monitoring and consulting kind of leadership style. I'm asking questions. I'm asking, what do you want to do? What do you want to see in 5 years? What are the key issues that we got to deal with? However, if I try to bring that style to people who have just come out of a disaster, it will be disastrous, frankly. I have participated in and seen effective facilitation at the survival and security stage that is marked by more directive and coordinating styles. So, for instance, we have, some of you know that there's a immigrant crisis at the southern border of the United States, northern border of Mexico. And we have a lot of people coming from Guatemala and Honduras and Mexico, and we've got a big political battle over it. Well, several of our cities in southern New Mexico have responded in very effective way to, because the federal government is basically washing their hands of any responsibility. So the municipalities have to take care of it. Well, what they do is, if you welcome people into a shelter, for instance, you welcome them and say, here are the hours, here's this here's how we do things, here's a place for you, here's a place for your children to play. This kind of gentle direction can be very welcoming and can help people with their accommodating and assimilating coping strategies. And we would say that's really facilitation. But you're not ordering them, you're not saying, you know, here are the rules, do this. But it's still a much more directive style. Tone might be different, but it's still a directive style. Let me continue. So we assign these ineffective coping strategies to correspond to the different stages. And I mentioned earlier, if people get locked into these, we believe that eventually they're going to need professional help, having experienced a secondary crisis. We think that helping people to recognize and practice these effective strategies at their different levels of stages of recovery can help them move toward resilience. And facilitating that is very important. And that's when we're moving toward reconstruction. So, well, I want to say a word about resilience and about the benefits of our approach, and then open it up for discussion.
Tim, I just thought I'd add something in on the chart there.
Please do. Please do.
And
Oops, sorry, I should be going backwards. Go ahead.
one thing that I find interesting about the model is it's both a model for individuals, but it's also a collective model for a community. And that, what you can find is both individuals, getting to the point where they're making choices, and sometimes they're choosing ineffective strategies, or sometimes they're choosing more effective strategies. But you can also see that happening in communities. And so it provides a way of thinking about where people, where individually and collectively people are at. I think also one of the points is we talk about where people, say if they get effective strategies, where do they get to? We talk about personal, social, community reconstruction. One of the things that I think is important to mention is that you never get back to where you were. Instead, you get back to someplace different. And hopefully, in doing this process, that someplace different will be, something, that is more that you would want than what you don't want. If you take the ineffective strategies, we find that you end up in that secondary crisis situation.
Thank you. Also, something I neglected to say. Let me, I know our colleagues from Poland talked about dialogue facilitation. And Faz, I don't know what type of facilitation background you may have. I have a long history with the Institute of Cultural Affairs and the technology of participation, and which I find to be very effective. And with this map, I can find ways of effectively adapting my own skill set to work with communities who are in this recovery process. So especially in the security and autonomy stage, to help people practice effective assimilation and activation strategies, I may really focus on the focused conversation process, or the ORID method, if people are familiar with that. This really helps me to design questions, to discern whether I should focus more at the objective or empirical or sensory level, or should I focus more at the interpretive or decisional or option level, or more at the reflective level where people can talk about their emotions. I can figure out how to frame my questions and how I can adapt my own tone so that we are aligned and we are working. When I'm working, if we're at the activate or associate level, I can begin to use my more I can use techniques such as strategic planning or the World Cafe or even open space. But I wanted to mention these very specific technologies and say that this map helps me figure out how to work them in an effective way, not just to do them because I think they're good. So,
one other thing to note about the map is that in a severe crisis, which is what we're often talking about, which is major earthquake or typhoon or hurricane going through, we're looking at recovery is 5 to 10 year period. So you get out to that, the endpoints there. And so this sort of gives you a little scale for planning your work, and also reemphasizes part of our work is encouraging local first responders and local people to learn facilitation skills or use the facilitation skills that they have to help rebuild their community, so they aren't dependent upon outside facilitators coming and doing it with them, because it's a long process.
Right. Yeah, I want to say more about that in a couple slides. That's great. But resilience, community resilience. What do we mean by this? Or there are a number of different definitions. we think that Center for Community Enterprise has some good ones, but the good definitions here that we lay out, and and the capacity of individuals to take intentional action, and resilient communities are aware of and use local and outside resources, are aware of and respond to attitudes and behaviors of local citizens, develop a range of organizations and groups that address local needs collaboratively and involve all segments of the population. This is really important as we begin to stress what we believe is effective facilitation here. And we have another definition here. What we're talking about is how people maintain the capacity to survive. And so we see neighbors helping neighbors. We see people figuring out how to, contact different organizations. We see people coordinating their outreach and training or relying on trained local people who will assist. So the benefits of our approach, I would say there are 4 principal areas where this really is how this is useful. So the first is personal behavior. I think that the map provides people, facilitators, with a set of terms and a set of values so that they can be more focused on their listening skills and their adaptation. We think that really this is about humility in a lot of ways, working with community. And the idea that there's an attention to rely on local knowledge and a willingness to align with local patterns. I think there's a train in the background somewhere. Thank you. And I just think that I have seen facilitators come to communities that have experienced crisis, and they really are quite full of themselves. They really think they can help. They have skills that will help people respond in a resilient way. And there's a savior mentality that creeps in, which I think, Mark, you kind of alluded to without that label I just provided. But I think that one thing, having this a map and these values in mind helps one do is not only to effectively adapt one's own skill set, but effectively align one's own attitude about how to help in a crisis situation. Another thing is to understand what one's job description really is. And for this, I'd refer people to the previous slide, which talks about, well, I'll go back to it in a minute. Excuse me. These 4 things that resilient communities have. Anyone helping a facilitator, that when you go into a community, helping them to respond, I think you're going to want to help make sure that people are aware of the resources, can respond in effective ways, can look for organizations that address local needs. So that these 4 bullets, to me, almost comprise a job description for facilitators in helping communities respond to disaster. The third benefit is that of understanding your facilitator network. And we think that we're expanding the definition of facilitators. It's not just people who are making money as professional facilitators, either internally or externally. We believe in these situations, anyone helping to strengthen community resilience is a facilitator. So a lot of our workshops are with people, our emergency personnel, medical technicians, teachers, clergy, local neighborhood, well, the way I put it is the auntie or grandmother who everyone goes to. I work a lot with Native American tribes and nations. And there are a lot of informal networks or networks that are not apparent to outsiders, natives. And it could be the janitor who is actually the war chief, the janitor of at the gymnasium. And that's the person you ought to be talking to as helping to facilitate community resilience. So understanding who a facilitator is, I think this helps a little bit. And finally, what this does is it helps people become more aware of their own need for self-care. We have a slide, if we have enough time, we can go. So that's our overarching presentation. And there are a number of books we have in our library on our website that you might want to take a look at to help in facilitating. But I want to ask if there are questions, and I also want to ask where people have their own insights about facilitating. But first, Mark, anything else you'd like to say as we wrap up? Wrap up the presentation, not wrap up the webinar. Sorry. Or Lenny,
no, I was going.
Any thoughts in presenting our model before we begin our discussion?
Tim, so ask, what is it that, this is Lenny, what is it that you're looking for participation on? I missed the
No, I'm saying what I'm going to do is ask our participants for questions they have and any insights they may have about facilitating in disaster situations, because we don't think we have the final answer. We think we have some ideas that are helpful and contribute. But we'd like to begin a dialogue, if possible, in our last half hour. But before we do that, I was wondering if you had any other points about our model that you'd like to present.
Okay. I first of all, thank you. I feel that what you presented is really clear, and of course, I have years of experience helping put that together, and I thank you for presenting it so clearly. What I've come to learn about this is that we are those people who are exposed to this model become resources for others. And it's important for us to learn from everyone's experience as they facilitate or lead these workshops, because one little nugget of success in a workshop can spearhead ideas in another community that is being worked with, and with the people that are working with that community. So the expertise that we develop is so important. It's so important for them to have the capability to share what they've learned from helping a community.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. BJ, anything you'd like to offer?
Unmute. Oh, okay. Yeah. Again, thank you. I guess the one overriding thing for me is to remember that while we're describing a common process or situations that people will experience based on a disaster, the solutions are always going to be different. And one of the things about our model is that each facilitator is going to access the resources of that particular community. So finding the solutions or the choices of solutions is always going to be different, no matter where it's applied.
Great. Yes, thank you. Let's go. Oh, go ahead, please.
Tim, I just wanted to, I was going to throw you one of the questions that's up here from Monica.
I was looking at
Was
that too.
how it can recognize the combination and simulation were successful.
Well, why don't you try it? Why don't you go first? Do you have some ideas? This is actually a very good question, Monica. Because we're talking about people at an early stage of responding to grief and crisis. And I think it's recognizing certain behaviors. So if you see that people are being more receptive to suggestions, if people are beginning to answer your inquiries, if they're willing to come to some kind of storytelling venue, you know, a lot of at the assimilation and autonomy stages, I think it's the idea of recalling. This is where the 2-minute before and after exercise can be very useful. And if people are participating in that, and if they're expressing their grief, that can be an expression of them successfully coping and being effective at coping in those situations. So they're participating and recalling. If they're processing their grief, if they're working with other people, they're participating. If you see these kinds of things going on, then I think people are beginning to integrate it. I think the other thing is, this is where the facilitator can be really helpful in crafting venues and questions for this integration process to go on. So you don't have to sometimes you call together a whole group of folks and say, let's talk about what happened and so forth, but you might actually facilitate in very informal situations around people's, I was going to say around people's kitchen table. If the kitchen table isn't there anymore, it may be at the school or at a center where things are happening. But you might have a couple people talk about it. You might have a half a dozen people talk about it. And then the kinds of questions you ask should, I think, begin to include not only what happened, but what have we been known for as a community? What were some of the things you really love about our community? And people can begin to recall the resources they may have at their disposal or are latent, and we can figure out places to start the rebuilding. Anybody else want to tackle that one? Is that helpful, Monica? Monica, is that helpful? Oh, very helpful. Thank you. Sorry, I gotta catch up on my chat. I'm sorry about that. Did you want to say something else, Mark?
I was just going to say it reminded me of Karen was working with some of the after the Chengdu earthquake with some of the survivors, and they had some people before her who had done some presentations, and the group was starting to disperse, and then Karen sort of came in and asked them to. She put posters on the wall and asked them to find somebody else and go up and draw pictures of what they'd experienced or what they'd seen over the last few weeks and months, and it just sort of shifted the whole experience of the group. And it started, it gave people a chance to really be thinking and experiencing, where they had been and hearing about other people's experience. And I don't know how you really quantify it, but you can sense it, that these things are happening.
Yeah, I agree. It's very hard to quantify when you say, how can you tell? I think it's a matter of close observation and where you see repetition of effective, I'm trying not to use the term positive, but effective strategies. We really try to be careful in some of our language. I've always been a little concerned about even using recovery in our model, because it is true, it's recovery, but it begins to move us towards sort of a medical model outlook. And we really think that it's important to maintain a focus on the primacy of local knowledge, even after disaster, and our alignment with and our adaptation to, and our reliance on local facilitation type personnel and skill sets and patterns. Rather than thinking, oh, we've got the answer. It's really, for people who earn their living being facilitators, it's really seductive to think, well, I'm pretty good in the boardroom. I obviously am going to be pretty good at the disaster center. Well, we're saying back away from that assumption and really take a close look at where the people are and what stage they're at and align yourself with that. So it's a matter of observation, I think, Monica, rather than saying or anything like that.
I'd really like to open up the group a little bit so that
Yes.
we can hear people talk. Andrea has a question here. Maybe, Andrea, would you like to speak it out?
Also, I want to go back. Ganapati had one too as well. So, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, Andrea, would you like to expand on your chat at all?
Hello?
We can speak to it if you want. But we thought if you'd like to say something, it'd be fine. Don't know how, okay, fine, no problem. So this is also a really good question. Mark, did you want to go to?
Oh, sorry, I think it looks like I finally unmuted it.
Oh, very good. Hello, greetings.
Hi, thank you so much for the information. I joined in a little bit late. It's 7 a.m. where I am. But I was just curious about your career journey and how you ended up facilitating in the context of disaster situations. And I guess I'm also curious about your role in the emergency management community and your interaction with other emergency management professionals and emergency respondents, and how that collaboration works, how are you called upon in the first place, and how do you fit into that whole picture?
Anybody want to start that? I've been talking a lot. Mark or Lenny or BJ?
Well, I'll start with how I got connected in with this. Was that the founder of GFSC, Gil Brenson, had decided to do a program in Hong Kong, and he asked me to help organize it. And I started organizing in Hong Kong. People said, "Why are we doing this? We don't have disasters in Hong Kong." And just a week before the program was about to start, there was an earthquake in Taiwan. And so I ended up telling Gil, maybe we should do a program in Taiwan. And so we went over there and did this for about 100 social workers, who then went down to the disaster area and worked with communities. And we've actually had an ongoing community of people in Taiwan that is carrying on this work. I think for all of us, all of us involved in GFSC, this is not our full-time job. It's a part-time thing that we do as there's opportunities to do it. And I should note that this is one aspect of facilitation in disaster situations. I do know that there are other roles for facilitation, like coordinating between the different disaster responders and things like that. And we aren't really addressing those needs, but we're looking at this very particular piece that we think has been under addressed, which is that social recovery process, and particularly helping local responders to use facilitation in dealing with that.
Lenny, do you have anything to say you'd like to say?
The notion that we're a volunteer organization should say a lot. Our vision about creating an awareness of a model that is works well with communities who have experienced a disaster, I feel is really powerful, and also recognizes that the importance of creating a space that's flexible for people to have discussions, not necessarily over a 2-hour period, but it could be for 15 minutes, depending upon where they are, to help them discover how they're going to move from where they are to a better place. That they're going to have to decide what that is. It's a real challenge, and it's never the same. And the important thing is having a flexible plan that's based on this wonderful model that we use.
So I'll just say a couple words. Andrea, it sounds like you may be on the West Coast of the United States, if it's only 7 o'clock there.
West Coast of Vancouver, yeah.
Oh, okay. And I'm, okay. Anyway, I would say my journey is, I'm an independent consultant and facilitator. I have my own job, own business, and I have worked in some situations here following hurricanes in Houston and New Orleans, mostly in a training role as to how we can coordinate with other emergency management folks, or how local facilitators can, we. In other countries, I know in Latin America, our Chilean colleagues are working with Walmart to figure out how to respond to some of the forest fires. And I'm not sure how it's being done, but they're working together in how that's doing. I've been really taken by the adaptability that this requires and allows, and the ability for it to be complementary with other models like psychological first aid is very prominent here in the States. Has a kind of sort of similar way of looking at things, although a little bit more medically oriented than we like, but it's pretty close. And so I know that helps a little bit. But I think that it really, as the other two commenters have said, it really depends on where you're at and the relationships you have.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, everyone.
Also,
I'm not.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure how to mute it back, so if you could mute me so I'm not too loud in the background. Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to acknowledge that Ganapati Balasubramanian has a question too. Rebuilding confidence after disaster, where there was large loss and challenge. How does this model help rebuild confidence? Mark, do you want to start? I feel like I'm talking too much, but.
Okay, I was just trying to see if I could unmute Karpoff. But
No, oh. What I will say, Ganapati, is a lot of what we're doing with the outline of these stages of recovery and what we have identified as being effective coping strategies really results in personal and community confidence building. It's a very big challenge, you're right. So the map is a way, you could say, resilience building is correlated with that is a lot of confidence building. The methods to help it happen are largely through conversation. So facilitation of good conversations at each stage can really help. So either on a one-to-one level, as Mark was saying, or as a community, or as community groups or as small groups of community, facilitators can help, especially at the simulation and autonomy levels, help people remember what their remember what their history is, what the strengths of their history are, what their resources are that might be available to them. This can all then, I don't know if it's a side benefit or it's a function or if it's something that goes along, but confidence builds as you have people focus on their strengths. You're not lecturing people to be confident. I know you weren't saying that. You're, as a facilitator, you're using your effective question asking ability and your listening skills and your humble approach to allow people to become aware of who they are, what they have, what they can rebuild on, where they're lacking and they need to get some outside resources. And then they can say it's a gradual kind of building from there. Does that help you respond to your question?
Yeah, it's a very nice response. I'm very thankful for this. It is more of like empathizing with the people who are really affected. They're already upset and then they need a kind of need to understand their old feelings. As you rightly said, facilitating a boardroom is different from facilitating a real disaster scenario where you see suffering and in the first place, and you need to be more human as you, the group rightly addressed the issue, and I'm very thankful for the response. Thank you so much.
Quite welcome. Becky, I know it's a private one. Yes, we found out from IAF that the slides will be available afterwards. And then you said, how do you build local facilitation capacity in a community? Well, I'm going to throw this open to the group. Who would like to respond to Becky Roberts? I think it's a great question.
Well, and can I elaborate a little bit on the question?
Sure, please.
I'm taking this and applying this into an environment where, you know, they haven't had an earthquake or a hurricane, but a community that's wrestling with poverty and violence and a history of oppression.
Okay.
And and looking at, you have some of the same kinds of psychological things going on there, but over a very long period of time. And so then the question is, what kinds of things can we do to help those communities to build their own internal capacity so that they can build resiliency and recover in new ways.
Can I ask, where do you find yourself working?
In the United States.
Yeah.
I'm East Coast based, but and actually I do some work with USAID as well. But right now I'm thinking about one particular city that I'm working with in the United States that has huge disparities between their poor communities and their other communities.
This is huge. There are a couple of things here. Let me give it a shot and then ask other folks. So in a corresponding way, I'm in the American Southwest, and I work with a lot of tribes and nations of Indians. And in Native America, of course, the idea of historical trauma is actually in the East too. I've actually worked with the Seneca Nation, and the idea of historical trauma is huge there. Boarding school movement and other things. People and Becky and I might be, if our references are obscure, please let us know. But the point is that there are big historical reasons and institutional reasons for people to be experiencing crisis. And building facilitation capacity in Native communities is just, and Hispanic communities where I am, is really important. And there are there are a couple different schools of thought. So I come out of the technology of participation with the Institute of Cultural Affairs. And I think that training folks is really important, but you have to start by acknowledging the reality of these different communities' experiences. In the States anyway, my experience is it's real easy to impose some solution that one has because one thinks it's skilled. So I think it begins by asking what they want and need. And then you have to another piece is you got to figure out an effective methodology of facilitation. There are several out there. We have some folks on the line from Poland who are doing dialogue facilitation. I know that has a whole set of methods itself. So I think it has to do with your approach, it has to do with the method, and it has to do with the application. And I think it's in some ways context specific. Those are some of the principles I operate with.
Okay, but my specific question was building local facilitation capacity. And so while I can see how, I can come in with colleagues and we can help facilitate some of that discussion in the community. But in terms of long-term change and resiliency in the community, the answer isn't outside facilitators.
No, I agree.
Right.
And like you talked about in Taiwan, you came in and you trained 100 social workers.
Yeah.
I would argue that in a community context, even the social workers are outsiders. And, I'm interested in ways to help the residents own their own resiliency.
So I still think you're talking about training people. So it's who you train. You have to figure out, is it local EMTs? Is it, you go to schools? Do you go to church groups? I appreciate that you're trying to not have reliance on outside resources. but training in a sensitive way is probably one way of looking at it. But I'm sorry, I'd like to ask other people to say something. Oh, Jimena, you'd like to add something? Please do.
Okay, hi everybody. Yes, I would like to add something. I think that we build local facilitation capacity when teaching local leaders what is happening to the community after a disaster, what is happening to themselves as leaders. Also, when we show them how to facilitate good conversations between the members of the community. When we teach them about the different stages that the community crosses after the disaster and the effective way of leading depending on the stage. That's it.
Anyone else like?
I should introduce that Jimena, who just talked, is the current president of GFSC.
So, are there any other responses or to Becky's ideas?
Yeah, I got a suggestion for Becky.
Please.
What you can try is try to identify 3 or 4 major areas of focus where attention is required, and try to create smaller teams. Create a very small team who can go and work on initially, and try to build a team and later on larger issues.
This is very helpful. Thank you. I think the other piece that I pulled out of what you said when you were talking about, you know, EMTs and schools and churches is to, you know, where the local capacity of their local organizations is so critical to be involved. Those are the places to go.
Yeah.
You know, what are the existing cultural constructs that you can build on?
Yes. To extend this even further, I have a cousin who's a professor of history at Prescott College. She's worked for over a decade in Maasai land in Kenya. And they've worked on land rights issues and a lot of institutional issues that actually correspond to in some ways to your point. She's worked for years to build trust, to be seen as authentically being able to speak to the community. So that's another part of the issue. Mark earlier talked about resilience building as being decades long sometimes. And so you're talking about a commitment, I think, as well, that's implied. I used to think that you could train people and then check in with them every 6 months. I think you're implying something much longer term there.
Thank you.
What other questions or comments do people have? We're getting to close to our 90 minutes.
I just had a quick question about what is the role of the disaster facilitator pre-disaster? So specifically in terms of mitigation, prevention, and preparedness.
Well, that's also a really good question. GFSC has and can help a little bit in creating disaster preparedness plans, but this is not our specialty. But I agree that, and I think a lot of U.S. cities, I bet Europe as well, and there may be other places in the world where, especially at the municipal level, people are talking about community resilience in terms of water supply and air quality and infrastructure, as well as the human and social issues. And so I think facilitators might be able to get involved either in a professional or volunteer capacity in helping to build disaster preparedness plans. One example of a workshop we did was with the City of Los Angeles Office of Disaster Preparedness. And the crisis change choice model really helped. I know the fire department really liked the way it laid out how it could train EMTs and its firefighters to respond more effectively, and have that as a component of an overall disaster preparedness plan.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge, this question of, do you do training and introduce this material before disaster, or do you end up doing it after the disaster? And we find ourselves doing a little bit of that work on both sides, depending upon where the community is, where things are at. But oftentimes, the basic workshop is somewhat similar. It's in that we go through, sort of helping people understand our thinking about disaster, then thinking about how do we facilitate, and then really getting into action planning. How can we actually use this material?
Right. Yeah, that's how our normal 3-day workshops go. Well, it's getting close to that 90 minutes. I'm sorry, I didn't want to. I want to say thank you to Faz for her comments as well, and agree with Jimena in the chat.
I'd like to just make a few mentions that we appreciate this opportunity to be doing more activities related to the IAF. This is our second webinar that we've been doing. And I've done a couple of presentations at some of the IEFs in Asia, and we also have done a couple of birds of a feather meetings at different conferences. And I know that Jimena will be presenting at the upcoming IAF in South America. So those are all things. Another thing that may be of interest to people is I'm in discussion with IAF on creating SIG around disaster, crisis and disaster facilitation.
A SIG is?
A SIG is a special interest group. And the idea will be that it would not be specifically a GFSC SIG, but it'll be, for all those of us who are interested or involved in facilitating, using facilitation in relationship to crisis and disaster recovery. And so as that develops, I will be sharing information out and inviting those of you who are interested in this topic to consider to join the SIG.
Thanks, Mark. And I echo your thanks to IAF for allowing us and helping us to do this. And I want to thank everyone for joining the call. Thanks so much. And thank you for your patience and for your questions. And if you have any further questions, please contact either Mark or me or GFSC. And we will get the slides out to everybody or have them available to everyone. And I will ask Muji or Hector to make sure that that happens. So with that, Please have a wonderful either rest of the day or a really good evening. And once again, thank you so much for your attention.